Hello, and welcome to the director's commentary of the Visitor series. This video will go over each episode in detail, providing you with a clear explanation of the story, how certain effects were made, and other information that may interest you. This will be a very long video since I have 6 episodes to go through, so for your convenience, timestamps for each topic are provided in the video and the description. Let's get right into it. When I first created the Visitor series, it began as nothing more than a short cinematic edit. This series ended up being incredibly more complex than I initially imagined due to the amount of new content that was continuously added to the game. At the time of the first episode, when the Visitor was revealed, everyone was coming up with different theories about him. The obvious one was that the Visitor was an alien who wanted to return home by stealing the rocket in the evil lair, and that's exactly what I did for this episode. One of the issues I ran into with this series is that the weekly loading screens don't really tell us who the characters are in terms of their personalities, so I had to come up with my own character development for most of the characters. Due to the unpredictable nature of Fortnite's story, I decided to make the Visitor unpredictable as well. He's basically a huge troll who only cares about himself and doesn't take anything seriously. I made sure the Visitor was tied to any event to allow me to continue the story in a mostly cohesive manner. I attempted to show the Visitor's odd nature in the first episode through the intro. The camera slowly pans up to the Visitor who has his smiley face display on and waves at us, making him seem nice and innocent. But then it cuts to him with the target display on, murdering random people on his way to the evil lair for no reason at all. Regarding the clips themselves, episode 1 and 6 featured real gameplay. Every other episode was done in Playground in order to properly tell the story through the clips. In this story, the superheroes are real, unlike the loading screens that show they're just actors in a movie. The reason they're in the evil lair is because they took control of it while Omega was away, which you see in Fractured. Before the first Visitor episode was made, I wanted to make a typical superhero movie which could be submitted to the Fortnite Blockbuster contest, but I ran out of time and decided to start with the heroes already having control of the lair. This episode was the shortest of all, so there's not much to talk about production-wise. Something you may have missed though is when Valor is eating popcorn looking at the different camera feeds. You see there's a camera watching the meteorite, but also Somber, one of my first Fortnite edits, is playing to the left. Another thing you may have missed is a voice on comms that says something like Tango has escaped grid FG56. If you take a look at the grid on the map, F5G6 is exactly where the meteorite used to be. I like leaving subtle hints like this, whether it's audio cues, Easter eggs, or simply character introductions. I don't recall doing this for every episode, but there are definitely a few scattered across the series. Some Easter eggs were meaningless, others were hints at what would happen in the story. Doomsday was the first episode where I started watermarking my content following the Instagram scandal. I wasn't a fan of putting a typical watermark that you just slap on the entire video because I felt that it would be distracting and it didn't really fit on edits. That's why I decided to 3D track them in more or less hidden spots. Watermarks certainly don't prevent people from stealing your content, but it's just a way of proving ownership of the video. Anyway, onto the episode. Episode 2 is also a short cinematic edit. The Visitor infiltrates the evil lair, kills the superheroes, and launches a rocket. Not much else to explain here concerning the story. You'll notice that at the end of episode 1, it's at night, but most of episode 2 is during the day. Back then, we had no control over the day-night cycle, and I was rushing to get this video done before the countdown of the rocket launch was over. That's also why you see a big jump between the timer in the first scene inside the house and the timer in the evil lair. A lot of the scenes were done out of order based on which one was quickest to do and had the least amount of people. The intro is also where I first started doing the technique cameos. I call her Somber just because that's the title of her first edit. She's a bit more important to my story than you may think, but throughout this series she mostly just lurks around. She's more of a character who pulls strings from the shadows. One issue about this episode was the pacing. A lot of the story got cut to fit the structure of the song and for me to finish in time for the rocket launch. Had I merged my rocket launch cinematic with the regular episode, similarly to what I did with episode 6, I think it would have been much better overall. No one knew what would happen with the Great Rift at that time, so in my story, I figured the visitor went through the rift with the rocket and spent time in another dimension. He would then return to the island at some point to continue the story. Fractured was a fun episode to make. It was the least stressful episode since there were no events or deadlines that forced me to finish it at a certain time. I made Fractured simply because people were asking, where's Omega? Why are the superheroes in the lair and not him? Well, here's your answer. I thought it would be funny if Omega decided to do some late night shopping and simply forgot to lock his door, which is why the superheroes took over the evil lair. At the beginning, we see him browsing items with the shopping cart. He pauses when he hears the siren in the distance, but continues shortly afterwards, thinking what he heard was just his imagination. Since this was a character introduction episode, just like the first Visitor episode, I focused on showing what kind of person Omega is. At the beginning of the series, Omega is a laughable supervillain. His late night shopping is actually breaking into the supermarket at night and stealing food. As he exits the store, he's about to steal a car and go back to his lair when he realizes the rocket launched. Omega reaches his lair and finds it to be empty. He runs straight to the monitors to figure out what happened. The Visitor is seen in a Viking village rifting away. I wanted to make it clear that Omega's goal was to locate the Visitor and kill him for stealing his rocket. At this point, the Visitor had already returned from the rift and now has gained control over them by stealing knowledge from other dimensions, allowing him to travel wherever and whenever he wants. This is a power exclusive to the Enforcers, which is why the Visitor is put on their wanted list, as you see in later episodes. Although the Visitor now has a new ability, he caused rifts to appear across the island, allowing anyone to use them, but only the Visitor is able to fully control them. Omega was furious that his rocket was stolen, which put him in a particularly murderous mood for this episode. To further show how evil he is, I had him kill various innocent people. A golfer minding his own business, people having a picnic, and a poor little Jonesy crossing a street. Omega killed anyone during his search for a rift that would bring him to the Viking village, and he finally finds one at the end of the episode. I chose the hill with the Durburger as the rift location because I wanted to hint at Drift being in the next episode. I had a lot of ideas with him and his squad, but I had to change a few story elements as I got further into the episodes because I realized I was starting to have way too many characters. Enforcer was a crazy episode. As of now, it has about 170k views, which is just insane. I never expected this video to get so popular. So, in this episode, we start off with introducing Ragnarok on his ship staring at the lightning strikes from the rift. I chose his tier 4 skin on purpose because I personally like it better. Since you're able to see his face, it allows him to have expressions and look more human, instead of being a big blue murdering machine with a skull mask. Next, we see the road trip squad at the motel. They were in the middle of getting ready to leave, which is why Rex is already waiting in the ATK. Cuddle Team Leader, the pink bearskin, was not in this scene because we could only be 4 in Playground, and she's not that important anyway. When the first Enforcer appears, I used an off-screen flare to simulate a rift effect, and the flippin' awesome emote to make it seem as if he hit the ground from a fall. The Enforcer's red eyes are just a glow and a shine. I wanted to make it clear that the Enforcers were here just to get rid of anything from the rifts, which is why this one scans the entire group. The ATK has a warning, Rex and Bright Bomber are clean, and Drift reads as an error. I even made his text flash to say, hey, something is different about this guy in particular. The Enforcer kills Drift, and the rest of the squad panics and drives away. Again, I was reinforcing the purpose of the Enforcers by making him stare at the squad running away, but he doesn't even attempt to shoot or stop them. The ATK hitting the motel sign wasn't in the script. Whoever was body acting with Rex is just a bad driver, but I thought it was a small detail that would be fun to leave in. It adds a bit more realism to Rex panicking. I was making this story prior to the introduction of the Rift to Go, which was something I hoped to be a throwable item like a grenade. If that was the case, I would have had the Enforcers cast Drift back to the real world instead of just killing him. Since it wasn't, I had to improvise a bit throughout the episode, like this part where the other 2 Enforcers rift in. This was simply reversed footage with some extra VFX. The first kill in the edit is two Viking twins at the base of the waterfall. I could have expanded upon this much more if I didn't restrict myself to fitting the edit to the song like I did throughout the entire series. Essentially, the enforcers invade the Viking mountain and completely exterminate them all except for Ragnarok. This is why he has a deep hatred towards the enforcers and seeks revenge by killing them all. The twins are Ragnarok's nieces or something. I never really gave their relationship much thought, but I wanted them to be connected. Something you may have missed for the second clip in Lucky Landing is that there are two enforcers on the roof eating popcorn while they watch the other enforcer get a kill. For the last clip, there was supposed to be an entire scene where the visitor's having fun, racing around with a new friend he made, then Omega was going to appear out of the rift back from Fractured. Omega would get in an ATK and race the visitor. The joke would be that the visitor thinks he's having fun with a stranger, but Omega is actually racing him to catch up and kill him. The enforcers would have appeared in the middle of the race to complicate things. They want to capture the visitor, but Omega wants to outright kill him. That entire scene got scrapped because I ran out of time and it didn't fit the song, so I settled with this clip where an enforcer blows up the racers in an attempt to secure the visitor, but he used his rift powers to escape. The entire ending was awful and rushed. The abrupt cliffhanger is something I still regret doing to this day. I would have preferred having at least a small battle between the two, but it's too late now. The post-title scene in this episode doesn't really serve any purpose other than to show that the visitor is planning something with the cube. This goes back to what I said earlier about how I made sure the visitor was tied to any live events in order to keep the story moving even though I had no idea what would happen next. This last scene was also supposed to be a bit longer. The enforcers would be chasing the visitor down as he gets cornered at the cube. He would turn around and then the cube would crush him. I gave up on that because the entire cube event became way too stressful. I needed to perfectly time the entire scene with the next cube flip. I know there were online timers so you knew when it would happen, but there were too many factors to consider for this to be feasible. Availability of people who could help with body acting, the terrain of the cube's location, time of day, not knowing on which side the cube would flip, and a bunch of other things. In the story, the enforcers think the visitor's dead, but he in fact merged with the cube when he got crushed. This is why the visitor doesn't reappear until the last episode. Now that the visitor's gone, the next episode shifts its focus on other characters instead. As my visitor story continued to grow, so did the amount of characters in it. I knew this would eventually cause issues because having to develop too many characters in a short amount of time is a very bad idea, and if I ended up with more than 4 main characters, it would be very difficult for me to continue with the story since we can only be 4 in Playground. That is why I killed off Drift and did not develop the road trip characters. I also began getting rid of more characters down the line. This episode starts with Ragnarok going back down to the waterfall following the Viking genocide. At the base, he finds an axe that belonged to one of his nieces. For those wondering, this was done by taking a screenshot of just the axe by manipulating replay mode. I then took a mask of it and messed around with 3D layering, distortion, color correction, and that's how I made it look like it was underwater. After grabbing the axe, Ragnarok has a flashback of his nieces. For Ragnarok, the axe is a burden because it's a constant reminder that he failed to save his village, and it's also a symbol of his vengeance at the same time. He makes his way back up when Omega finally appears after searching for the correct rift that would bring him in there. He lands in front of Ragnarok and asks him about the visitor. This hologram effect was the only way I could think of to convey this message without dialogue. This effect was done by green screening the visitor, adding some radio distortion, coloring, and I added a flare that was tracked to Omega's hand. Ragnarok agrees to help Omega search for the visitor as long as they kill as many enforcers as possible while on their journey. Omega waits as Ragnarok prepares himself and sits at the edge of the mountain overlooking a rune location, which is also the location of the first clip. Ragnarok puts on his skull mask and the new team begins to exterminate the enforcers. The skull was pretty much done the same way the axe was, except this shot focused much more on lighting and shadows instead of distortion to make it look real. This episode only had 2 clips, unfortunately. There was going to be a really cool guided missile rocket ride clip that I wanted to do, but I scrapped it yet again because only 2 clips fit the song. Although the visitor is gone, the enforcers are still investigating the cube which is connected to the visitor. The heroes completely wipe out the enforcers except for a very small group of survivors who lurk around the island just in case my story needs them. Also, I say heroes because at this point in Omega's character development, he becomes less of a villain. I always wanted Omega to start out evil, then slowly change into a good person, but at the time of his introduction, I wasn't sure how I would do that. The post-title scene of this episode was actually not supposed to be part of the story at all. I was unfortunately at school while the Loot Lake event happened, so I had to ask around to see if someone could give me the replay file. The person who gave it to me just happened to have the Rook skin, so I decided why not add her to the story somehow. Keep in mind that the visitor merged with the cube, so he's actually in the lake as well. Speaking of the last episode, ever since the introduction of Calamity, Deadfire, Dusk, and all the new Season 6 skins, I was overwhelmed with all of these characters. Because of that, a lot happens in episode 6. As the series went on, each episode became longer to make. The last episode of the Visitor series was even more of a pain because I wanted this to be the last episode, but new story elements kept getting added. I started working on Darkness as soon as Season 6 began, when the hovering island was just above the whirlpool at Loot Lake. As I was making this episode, the island kept moving and new things happened to it which forced me to go back and change the story a bit. I was stuck in this loop of constantly changing the story right until the very end when the butterfly event occurred. I ended up merging 3 episodes into one essentially. I wasn't able to finish episode 5 the way I wanted to, so I had to finish it in episode 6 with Ragnarok and Omega, but I also needed to finish up with the Visitor, then have the new Season 6 characters in the story as well. I wanted to avoid having too many Season 6 characters overlap with the Season 7 characters. Finally, since the cube explosion happened, I added that to the end of this episode as well. I learned from my previous pacing mistake back in episode 2 with the rocket launch, so this time I included the entire event without skipping any parts. There were a lot of technical hurdles in this episode as well, which made it much harder for me to make. Moving on, let's get into the story of episode 6. The opening shot is something I like doing, where you have 2 subjects, but one is in focus. The establishing shot is just to show that the scene will take place at the lake, and the background subject is a sort of foreshadowing of what will happen later in the episode with the island. Next, we see Rook from the previous episode watching over the whirlpool. Rook is a field agent for a secret organization. She's scouting out the area when she suddenly gets a radio call from someone that says something like RK-71 requesting backup on grid H4.
RK-71 requesting backup on grid H4.
RK-71 is code for the Sledgehammer skin who was unlocked at tier 71 in the battle pass. I named him RK instead of SH because, I don't know, it just sounded better to me. Sledgehammer was supposed to play a part in another episode involving side characters that would tie into the Visitor series. However, the main story was moving by so fast that I couldn't really keep up. So for now, all of the filler episodes that I had planned are scrapped. Also, grid H4 is where the Wailing Woods corrupted area is located. Upon getting the call, Rooks takes a quad crasher and drives there. As she leaves, a shadow form emerges from the whirlpool and reveals itself to be the Visitor. Both of these characters just missed each other, so Rook didn't see the Visitor and the Visitor just barely saw Rook leaving. The Visitor doesn't know or care about Rook, so he ignores her and turns to his main objective, the hovering island. Next, we cut to the heroes walking through a corrupted area. This is soon after they exterminate the enforcers and decide to go to the island, assuming the Visitor's there. The part where they land on top of the island was really annoying because in replays the cube growth that you see around the house disappears if you skip forwards, backwards, or if the island was outside of the replay area. Every time I wanted to get a camera angle, I would have to start the replay over and wait about 15 minutes just to get one shot. If I messed it up or didn't like how it turned out, I would have to start it all over again. This is why some shots here are a bit worse than I could have recorded. I got so frustrated with certain camera angles that I just settled with what you see now, even if it wasn't perfect to me. Ragnarok and Omega decide to split up while searching the area. Ragnarok investigates the house while Omega walks around outside, but he gets distracted by the view. During this, the Visitor, who now has control of his shadow form after merging with the cube, creeps up behind Omega, gives him a little spook, and kills him. Originally, Ragnarok was supposed to hear the gunshot, run outside, and injure the Visitor with his hunting rifle. The Visitor would then escape to Wailing Woods, where a final battle between Ragnarok, him, and Rook would occur. That would lead into Fable, and then the werewolves, and then more story elements with the secret lab, but the Cube event changed all of that. I also knew this episode was going to be packed, so I didn't want to introduce all of these new characters and start a bunch of different stories within one episode. In the story, Ragnarok and the Visitor were fighting on the island until they were both caught in the cube explosion. Now, both of them are stuck in the Nexus, which is the white butterfly dimension. I basically put both of those characters on a shelf instead of killing them off because I like Ragnarok. I feel like I could do more with him in the story, and the Visitor is of course an important character. I would seriously regret killing him off on screen just to realize I need him a few episodes later. But as it stands, both of them are out of the picture. After the cut to black, it fades into Omega's helmet. The Visitor shot him in the face, which knocked off his helmet, making it get carried around by the vortex, and it landed there. This VFX was done the same way I made Ragnarok's skull mask, a bit of 3D layering, shadows, and color correction. Now, here's the second part of the story, the introduction of Calamity. She's outside doing yard work, looking at the portal in the sky. She turns to her house to grab her gear from her room. She goes to the back to her parents' graves to give some final words, then heads off towards the darkness. Her initial goal was to seek out the vampires who killed her parents, but along the way she encounters cube monsters that block her path. Meanwhile, Deadfire appears on the Battle Royale island. For his introduction, I recreated what happened in the Fortnite cinematic trailer. To pull off the animation where he gets up from his knees, I manipulated the revive animation. I had to go into a live match, down myself on the bus, then have my teammate who was hiding under the bus revive me. Then in replay, if you skip back correctly, you can get rid of the yellow glow the player has when they get revived, so it looks normal. Next, Deadfire meets up with Calamity and they team up to kill the rest of the cube monsters and push back the darkness. The clips of this episode are really low quality in terms of camera work and action because I had to record all of this in live matches since there were no cube monsters in Playground. Because of that, the clips are less clean and original than clips from previous episodes. After the editing part, I added the entire cinematic sequence of the butterfly event from the moment the cube spins to when Leaky Lake changes. Had I known what the event was going to be, I would have recorded the entire event using the Visitor instead of Technique. As I mentioned, Ragnarok and the Visitor were still on the island when it exploded, so they were transported to the Nexus and are stuck there until I consider them useful again. And that marks the end of the Visitor series. It was quite a crazy journey, and I thank everyone who stayed with me throughout it. The Visitor series may be over, but that does not mean I'm not making cinematic edits anymore. The new AIM skin seems like he will play an important role moving into Season 7, so I'm shifting my focus on him instead of the Visitor. As some of you may have seen on Twitter, I'm already working on the first episode of the new series about him. Unfortunately, I'll have to skip a few episodes I had planned, such as Calamity vs. Dusk, the werewolves, and other side stories, since Season 7 is already here. Moving forward, I'm not sure how I'll be making the episodes of the new series. If I make the main episodes longer, they may be more appealing, but that gives me less time to work on other projects such as shorter episodes, normal edits, and other content. Believe it or not, the Visitor series consumed my life while I was making it. With the exception of my Fortnite edit, which only took me like 2 days to make, I've only uploaded Visitor videos for the past 3 months. Anyway, I've been talking for way too long, so let me know your thoughts on all of this, and I'll be glad to read the comments. If you watched until the very end, thank you very much, and this concludes the director's commentary of the Visitor series. I'm certain I missed some things or didn't explain certain points clearly, so if you still have questions about the story, feel free to leave a comment. Until next time.